Coming up on the NESN Bruins podcast, we try to figure out what is wrong with the Bruins. We also look at the recent trade of Taylor Hall to Arizona, and we wonder what it would take and why the Bruins might want to bring Ilya Kovalchuk to Boston. Play the music. Hello, welcome to the NESN Bruins podcast. I'm NESN.com's Mike Cole, joined, as I often am, by also a member of the NESN.com's esteemed team, Logan Mullen.
Hey Mike,
how are you?
I'm good. I'm cold.
It
might be colder in here than it is outside.
is freezing all over this. Well, I guess the studio is cold. It is.
Should get Mark to crank up the heat in here.
It's about 15 degrees outside, so I'm willing to cut some slack.
Vents.
Yeah, it is. I think we're a little colder, or a little closer to the windows, perhaps. There's a lot going on, but it is certainly winter, although it is not technically winter. We are a few days away from that, which means we are a couple days away from the real hockey season being upon us.
Is that right?
I don't know. It just feels like there's so many different benchmarks or milestones you could use in a given season, whether it's Thanksgiving, Canadian Thanksgiving,
we've
American
got the
Thanksgiving.
Holiday roster freeze coming
Correct.
up. Yeah, pre-holiday roster freeze,
so
post-holiday roster freeze.
There's Christmas, there's New Year's Day with the Winter Classic is also a milestone.
Trade deadline.
Trade deadline comes up. I think there's that.
April.
Sometimes you have a winter or an Olympic break in there as well. Perhaps maybe the World Juniors is coming up. You can use that as something to use as a gauge. So there are a lot of milestones in the hockey calendar. So we will. I don't think anyone's ever really used the first day of winter as one, but
the winter solstice.
Yeah, I think that's where I'm
That's
at.
when hockey season really begins.
It is nuts though to think about with the Bruins is that it was just. It feels like 3 weeks ago that they were in the Stanley Cup final in June when it was nice and warm. It's a long season.
Yeah, well, we're working on our moments of the decade for NESN.com, and one of mine for just 2019 was Game 7 of the Leafs series. I went back and watched it, and I was there, and I was thinking, Jesus Christ, I forgot like 90% of what happened in that game. I was like, oh yeah, that was the Joakim Nordstrom goal game, and crap, Tuukka Rask was really good in that one. It's like, how long ago? It's like, it was 7 months.
It's weird. I barely remember
Time is flying.
What happened in the last week or so. Speaking of the last week or so, not a whole lot of good going on for the Bruins, and that is what we're here to discuss, is the Bruins on the Bruins podcast. If I'm not mistaken, they went 1-1-1 last week, and they're still kind of scuffling. I mean, we're at a point here where they're not playing especially well in any phase of the game. We kind of talked about this last week, is that there was probably some regression due, but I don't believe that doesn't feel like the universe getting even with them. It just feels like they're getting what they deserve right now. So I don't know if there's a whole lot to say in regards to that. They have to play better, but that being said, I did the math. They're still on 115 points pace. So
something else, yeah.
I think they're probably going to end up somewhere between that and 100, because I feel like that early season run is obviously unsustainable, but I think they're going to turn it around at some point.
Yeah, I mean, you'd have to think that they'll be fine eventually. However, my gripe with how they've played isn't so much the fact that they are losing, but who they're losing to.
Yeah, that's true.
Right? And you can look at it two different ways. So one is, in this current stretch, they've lost to the Blackhawks, who are, I believe, the worst team in the Western Conference, the Kings, who I believe are the second worst team in the Western Conference, and the Senators, who are one of the worst teams in the Eastern Conference. All of those are losses, some of them ugly as well, particularly the Senators' loss. So you can look at that as well. They're losing to teams they shouldn't be losing to, and in some cases, getting thoroughly outplayed.
Yes.
Conversely, though, you can also say, well, they've got two benchmark losses, benchmark games, however you want to put it, against the Capitals and against the Avalanche, and especially against Colorado, they proved that they're not really ready to compete with those guys. I don't know if that's taking it a little bit too far, but when they're in this rut, they had a couple chances to kick themselves out of it. And to me, it's been well documented how I feel about the Florida Panthers. I thought that was a very good win for the Bruins, a good one to get back on track.
It was technically a win, but I didn't think it was a great win either because they were up early in that game and let Florida get back into it.
Which is what happened, whatever it was, a month ago when they lost 5-4 The 12th.
Yeah.
So almost a month to the day since that meteoric collapse at home against Florida. So
that's right, yeah.
It's an inability to finish games, right? Like it's a complete reversal from what happened last season, or earlier in the season rather, where they were able to erase seemingly any deficit in the third period, but now they're struggling to hold on to leads, and sometimes it results in a win like it did against Florida most recently, but other times it's going to result in a loss kind of like it did against the Kings.
Yeah, that's true. Although didn't they, am I mistaken here? I am looking it up real quickly. This is not great podcasting. I mean, there was yes and no. I mean, they came back against Chicago. That wasn't that long ago. I'm not trying to poke hole in your. I guess the overarching point here is that they're finding multiple ways to lose games. Yeah. So that's actually indicative of what they're playing. Like I'm just looking at their hockey reference page right now, and granted, 2 of them are the overtime losses, but there's just a lot of L's right now. So
Lots
like
of
I said,
L's,
they're finding different ways to lose. So they're keeping it interesting at the very least. I will say, this is just kind of a tough stretch in their schedule.
It is.
Although they have lost to the worst teams in their schedule, but that 4-game road trip it's kind of a bear. Anytime you come back home after a road trip, typically you'll see a team play poorly, and that's kind of what happened against the Kings. I do wonder too if there's just a general and almost natural lack of complacency starting to set into. I don't know. It's hard to believe that it's just weird though, because like you would have expected this type of play earlier in the season,
October,
coming off of
it's what people were kind of expecting.
Yeah, so it's been kind of a reversal where like they would have stumbled out of the gates, then finally eventually put it together and gone on a wicked run because they were better than everybody. And looking back too, I don't know, like again, this is probably just all water finding its level, because it wasn't like in a lot of those games where they were earlier in the season, they were just early in the season when teams aren't as motivated maybe or whatever, they weren't outworking teams. Like they struggled for those points at times, or they staged late comebacks and things like that, kind of to your point earlier. So I don't know. I think if you want to use like the end of the calendar year as a breaking off point, I think, what do they have? Six games left? 6 games left before the new year.
Yep.
If they go 4-2, 3-3 in those games and there's some tough games in there, especially the next 3-game stretch, 4-game stretch.
Capitals, couple against
5,
Buffalo.
even if you want to count. Buffalo's having a nice season. So this is a strict test. So I think if they go 4-2, 3-3, they're going to be right about where you might have expected, ironically, at the end of the calendar year, where they'll be at near the top of the Eastern Conference, at or near the top of the NHL, but with some room to improve. So I think it actually kind of in an interesting way is all working itself out.
Well, yeah, and again, it's only benefiting them that they banked points the way that they did.
It's weird though, like how much it's funny, like those you can't take away from those, but you're also leaning on it at the same time.
Well, and I don't want to couch our takes too much here.
Well, whatever.
But in the interest of wavering on takes, I mean, this current losing streak comes immediately after an 8-game winning streak.
Sure.
Right? So it depends on the lens that you're looking through. But what were we saying back in October is once the goaltending starts coming back down to earth, for me, this is the common denominator, because they've had stretches where they struggle to get scoring outside of the top line. They've had stretches where they've had lackluster defense and trouble clearing the zone. But every single time they were bailed out by the fact that both of their goaltenders were playing among the league's 3 to 5 best. But now that both of them have not been bad, but just leveled out a little bit, you want to talk about water reaching its level, that's what, to me, seems like is the issue's a strong word, but basically the goalies no longer are just making up for the mistakes that's happening in front of them. And you look at that Kings game for an example. You could forgive Tuukka Rask for not making some saves that he needed to make, but he saved your caboose 8 times already this season, making saves he had no business making.
Yeah, he wasn't especially good in that game at all. But that's neither here nor there. Actually, as I think about it, and I'm kind of looking at the schedule now, has there been a point, and this kind of speaks to your point, is that early on the goaltending was great, and it kind of bailed them out. Now it's not so much, and they're having issues elsewhere as well. Has there been a real point this year where they've had everything going at once? And it doesn't feel like it. The only thing I can think of looking at the schedule here, and it's jogging my memory, is they had to run a 6-game winning streak the end of October into November, where
the Leafs to the Penguins.
Yeah, where they beat the Leafs and then they pasted the Blues at home. That had that big win at the Rangers, and then a few other lopsided games in there. That Penguins game as well. I guess that's the only time. There wasn't. Yeah. They didn't really have to come from behind in any of those games. There's an 8. No, wait, I was looking at the wrong column. 3-0 win in there, a 7-4 win, a 5-1 win, and a 5-2 win. So those are decisive victories. But other than that, there hasn't been a time where they've all clicked at the same time.
The talent there was, sorry to interrupt, talent there was so much better in that stretch, because even if you look at the 8-game run, the Devils, who just got rid of their franchise player, the only potential playoff teams in there are the Sabres, maybe the Canadiens, and maybe the Rangers, and then the Hurricanes.
Yeah, and you have a pair of overtime wins in that run as well, so it wasn't like it was, extremely one-sided, and a lot of one-goal games there against teams like, Ottawa and the Rangers, and so yeah, I don't know what point we're really making. We might be spinning our wheels here a little bit at this point, but it's just one of those things where I don't think everything is clicked at once, which isn't to be, I think that happens for everybody, and it takes you a while to really kind of come into clicking fully. And there have been injuries. I think it'd be unfair to them not to mention that they've dealt with injuries. So I still don't think that they're, what are their lines? You can't sit here and say that other than the first line or second line, maybe even then, even the middle six they've been juggling all season. I still don't think they found it, and I think that's the luxury of banking those early points, is you can kind of work your way through some of these issues and wait for guys to get healthy or figure out what your best chemistry is and go from there. So they're still kind of figuring that out, and I think they're just about every team in the league would rather be in their place than their own. So
true.
I don't know. Is there anybody specifically you wanted to touch on?
Well, the lines, we did 20 minutes on Brett Ritchie last week, so maybe steer away from that this time. But the lines are a little bit confusing. I don't like Coyle as the second line right wing. It's going to be a black hole pretty much no matter what. I'd rather have 3 relatively balanced lines instead of making for whatever reason, Sean Corrali just doesn't do it for me as a third line center. That fourth unit that they have with Corrali, Nordstrom, and Wagner, they need to keep that together. They need to keep the third line of Bjork, Coyle, Heinen together, and they need to keep the first line together. And then, you've sandbagged David Krejci for 5 years now, so what's another few games while you try and figure stuff out? You put David Backes with him, you play him 10 minutes a night, and there you go. You at least have 3 balanced lines. But the shifting just to effectively make themselves a top-heavy team doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me.
So I assume you like the Thursday night lineup against the Islanders when it looks like Heinen will be on the second line, right wing, Wagner playing third line, right wing.
See, I like Wagner on the fourth line too.
So what do you want to do? Whatever.
Put Backes on the second line. That's not a great group by any means, but what else are you going to do? Because if you put Wagner's not a third line center, what are you doing there?
Was he third line winger?
Or a third line winger, that's what I meant. Because then you're crossing your fingers that Bjork, who is for the most part played well, but gives you
fine.
But Charlie Coyle's a puck possession center, right?
Yeah.
So you need somebody there who's at least willing to shoot.
Yeah,
right. And I'd say Heinen's probably far more willing to shoot than Chris Wagner is, right?
Yeah.
So it gives keeping Bjork and Heinen with Coyle at least gives Coyle people to pass to. He doesn't have to try and create all the offense himself.
Yep, that makes sense. I guess we can kind of use this as a springboard into our next couple of topics. until they figure out that second line right wing, and they may never. I mean, we could be 15 years down the road and still not figuring it out. Until they figure that out, I think you don't really know what you have or what you can be, or you're not going to maximize your full potential. So that's why I thought, the talks about a couple players this week were relatively interesting. I guess we can start with Taylor Hall, who was all of a sudden, I would imagine the Christmas freeze kind of sped up this process. It's kind of like a mini built-in deadline. It just seemed like out of nowhere that the Taylor Hall sweepstakes kind of picked up speed and kind of went into overdrive. Bruins never really in that, according to reports, or they weren't mentioned in a ton of reports, but he ends up going to Arizona for, was it 3 players, a 2020 first-round pick and a conditional third-round pick in 2021. You wrote on NESN.com why the Bruins probably were never really in the running here. Do you think they should have been, despite all of that?
For what
you can lay out your reasons as well.
For what he ended up being traded for, no.
Yeah, so that's a pretty big haul. Giving up 3 players is a lot, regardless of the talent. But I mean, a first-round pick for a rental is. I don't think that's going to be something we see Don Sweeney do.
No, I think
unless it's for the absolute right player. And I guess you could argue Taylor Hall might be that.
Well, and they'd
the
be
Rick
hard
Nash
pressed.
trade kind of burned him.
Yeah, and I think they thought that they could re-sign Rick Nash, and had he not
gotten
more concussions,
right.
He probably would have, right? There's no guarantee at all, 1, that Taylor Hall will be interested in re-signing, or 2, that they'd find a way to create the cap space to re-sign him. So why give up such an insane haul for that? And I think part of the reason you saw multiple draft picks going back to New Jersey is because the Devils didn't pluck anyone off of the Coyotes roster as it stood, right? And
sure.
And so for the Bruins, they are so tight up against the cap in the first place that even if they had prorated, or with Hall's prorated cap hit, it would have been tight to fit him in without taking a player off the current roster. Anyone with significant enough money to move to where you could kind of match figures, you're impacting your roster, because the only player who's making more than $2 million that's not really making an impact is Backes, right?
Yeah.
I'd be very surprised if the Devils were willing to make that kind of commitment without big draft picks coming back, big prospects coming back. I just don't think Don Sweeney wanted to do that. And in terms of why I think the Hall deal sped up in the first place was he's got an injury history. The Devils would be stupid to just keep rolling him out there knowing they were going to trade him. His value wasn't going to change at all. So they're basically just walking under ladders every single time they threw him out there, knowing that their team was not directionless, but not making the postseason. But even if the Bruins, I would not be surprised if they kicked the tires on it, but the second a first-round pick came into the conversation, I would say that was probably a non-starter.
See, if there was anything, I think it's probably maybe the prospects that they didn't have to get it done, because
they probably do.
Yeah, I guess. I mean, I don't know a ton about the guys that Arizona gave up. I guess the Bruins probably can match that. My thing is, the more I think about it, like if you even giving up that first round pick, I probably would have done it. Like I think this is, if there was ever a time to go in, it's right now. Like what other time in this run or this core's chapter or whatever you want to call it would you be at a better time to push in your chips?
Yes, but that does, I agree, but that flies in the face of how Sweeney's operated, right?
But
like
I mean,
he's built this team to be sustainable for years. I understand the aging
so you can
core.
So you can go to the Eastern Conference Final or whatever for the next 5 years.
Okay,
fine, that's real sustainable. But like,
do you want to be the Blackhawks right now? Do you want to be the Kings right now? I mean, those teams went all in, depleted their prospect pools, and now they've been the worst teams in the Western Conference for 3 years now. So, if you trust your current group enough right now, and it would probably resonate well in the dressing room if they saw Don Sweeney investing assets, saying, no, we really think we can win. But I think everybody knows that in the first place, and I think they're pretty confident that they can win with the way their roster's constructed now, even for the shortcomings that it has.
No, that's true. I mean, they lost the Game 7. That is, for as poorly as they played, a virtual coin flip when you're going into it.
Right.
But, if you go out and trade for a Taylor Hall, that puts you, you would think, hopefully, where you don't need to flip a coin in Game 7 of the Stanley Cup final.
Your top 9 depth is probably the best in the league if you get Taylor Hall.
And so that's why I would do it. Like, I think, I don't know. I look at it, I understand the need to have foresight and, to not get too carried away with 1 year, but I also think at some point you have to cash in on the value of a player or a contract like Marchand or a Pastrnak. Like, you have these guys who, on the open market, if they were, they aren't. The difference between the Bruins and the Blackhawks, for instance, is that the Bruins aren't paying, Marchand and Pastrnak combined $22 million or whatever it is per season. So, those cap hits are not relatively manageable. They're extremely manageable for what you're getting out of those players. And so I think you have to cash in on that at some point because, those guys aren't going to be under those relatively team-friendly deals forever. So you might as well take a chance at it one time. I understand that in doing that, you're kind of screwing yourself or potentially screwing yourself in the long run. But if you trust in your scouting and developing, maybe you find a way to make it work in the long run. But that's, easier said than done. Yeah. And I think it's probably easier for them, especially, to trust the process and continue to do what they're doing right now.
And this is just conjecture, but if I had to guess, I would say that whatever the Devils were willing to do, like whatever type of deal they were willing to craft with the Bruins in order to get that trade done, like to get Taylor Hall to Boston, it would have been well beyond what Sweeney was comfortable doing. Because I don't think they would want to do just a pure hockey trade, and that's kind of what the Bruins would have to do, right, is pluck guys off the current roster. And I don't think they were comfortable doing that, and I don't think they were comfortable giving up multiple high picks.
They're in a weird spot, too, because what would a hockey trade look like?
Yeah, that's another thing. Like, it would have to be big money, right? It would probably have to be Backus and then high-end prospects, right? So you're probably giving them, and again, just floating ideas. It would probably be something like DeBrusk, right?
I would be pretty tempted by that, though. I still would be. I don't want to trade away the roster, but
Grzelcyk.
That one I would be a little more hesitant about. But I think, I don't know. I don't want to be a prisoner of the moment, but with DeBrusk or whoever. And that's the issue you have when you start talking about trading roster players, is that you can't always judge those guys about what they are right now, even more so than prospects. So I don't know. It's something that I like those deals every once in a while for a team, a team like the Bruins, where you just kind of go all in and say we're doing it this year and kind of going after it. I wonder if once the deadline comes closer, maybe they reconsider, but I don't know.
Well, and I think the way teams are thinking has changed, right?
Yeah,
so like the Coyotes are going to have, they're tied up against the cap now too. They probably know that they're not re-signing Hall this offseason, but they clearly think they can win now. So instead of saying, we're going to totally strip ourselves of assets and whatever.
Yeah.
Like, you look at what Columbus did last year, and they knew they were probably losing Panarin. They knew they were probably losing Bobrovsky. And they said, you know what, screw it. Let's just go all in because we don't know what the future holds for us, and we think we can win. And they were 2 games away from playing in a conference final that they probably could have won.
It's a lot easier to do that in Phoenix and Columbus than it is in Boston, probably. Because if the Coyotes suck next year, they're not going to be. What's the drawback? They fall behind the Suns and the Cardinals in terms of, or the Diamondbacks in terms of interest out there. Like, when you're in Boston, that long-term sustainability is more valuable in the market than maybe just that one championship.
Yeah, I just don't think Sweeney would be willing to mortgage the future for a guy they didn't think could re-sign. And I'm pretty convinced that they would not have been able to find a way to re-sign him without making drastic moves elsewhere on the roster.
Yeah, I know. I agree with that, I guess, but it's just...
Yeah, right or wrong.
One time at a certain point, I think if I was the general manager in any sport, I think you build a team up to get to a certain point where you can see that championship. And maybe they're already there, and that's part of the reason too. I mean, I don't want to lose sight of the fact that they played in a Game 7, but of the Stanley Cup final, they were that close to winning it all. But flags fly forever. I mean, if you can if there's one move that could put you over the top, maybe you go for it. And who knows? Maybe the Bruins, maybe the Bruins knew that they weren't going to be able to put together a package that rivaled the Coyotes one anyway.
Well, that, and I think that they probably learned from last year too that you can get useful players at the trade deadline for relatively little, right? It was a second and a fifth for Marcus Johansson.
Yeah.
It was Ryan Donato and a late pick for Charlie Coyle, and it's easier to fit those guys under the cap too because you're further along in the season, so their cap hits further prorated. So that, and at that point too, more teams have fallen out of contention, right? So there are probably 5-6 teams right now that think, okay, well, we still might be able to get into the playoffs. Let's see if we catch fire. But if they don't and they're out of the picture at the deadline, then okay, they're sellers now. So you might have a little bit more of a market to work with.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see if the Bruins' philosophy changes at all as the deadline approaches, and whether they do a little more big game hunting this year as opposed to last year. I mean, it's hard to argue with what they did last year. But like I said, the biggest thing for me right now is just that clear hole on that second line right wing. So if you can find a way to plug that somehow, you go a long way in kind of fixing up a lot of those issues we were talking about earlier with the roster.
Absolutely.
Moving on, another big name player who has been tied to the Bruins, per Russian hockey reporter Igor Aranko. Bruins reportedly have some interest, at least, in Ilya Kovalchuk, which feels like a storyline that's been recycled for years now with the Bruins and a handful of teams. But he's out there. It's a player who is polarizing, to say the least. You can't argue with what he's shown throughout the course of his career as a goal scorer. He does some things with the puck on his stick that a lot of players can't do, but there are a ton of question marks about the other parts of his game. I don't know. It's hard to speculate on this too much because we don't know a ton, and I don't think anybody else even backed up that report that they had interest in him. But
I think Bob McKenzie said that Boston was not
that's true. I think that's
there
correct.
have been a few different.
All right, but let's just say they are. Is it a deal that you'd look into making if you were the Bruins?
Yes. And when things first started really going south with him in LA, I wrote that they shouldn't go after him because it was going to require inheriting that cap hit of his. Well, now that he was put on waivers, the Kings are holding on to that cap hit. So you can get him for the veteran minimum, and that's what you're paying for. The Bruins can do that. And it's not so much Ilya Kovalchuk. In some senses it is, but it has to be because it involves him. But the Bruins have no other options, right? So if you don't trust Carson Kuhlman that much, or you don't want to trust Zach Senyshyn, you've effectively handcuffed yourself to David Backes and Brett Ritchie. Why not take a flyer on Ilya Kovalchuk? Be very forthright about the fact that if he can't produce at all, then he's going to be sitting on the 9th level. Why not take a flyer on him? I mean, he's still, for all of the issues that he had in LA, he still had 16 goals last year in 64 games. Like, the shot, while certainly not what it used to be, still exists. Like, he's not totally useless. And I get that he was a bad part of a very bad Kings team. Maybe he needs a change of scenery, but for very little money, like, what harm are you doing by just taking a look?
I mean, is it guaranteed that you're getting him for very little money?
I think so. I don't know who's paying him any sort of significant money right now. And part of the reports are that he would be willing to take money that low. So he's still going to get paid by the Kings for the next 2 years.
Yeah. How is that? I mean, so what do they have for cap room right now?
I don't know, like $1 million something.
So, like, are you willing to burn that or burn a chunk of that for Ilya Kovalchuk in the very, well, not very, but the strong possibility that he sucks?
They have about $1.8 million in cap space. So you're essentially leaving yourself with $1 million. So my thing too is, okay, that's fine. But if you're going to
a month and a half before the deadline,
yes, and I understand that. However, you have $1.8 million in cap space right now. Who are you going to be able to get at the trade deadline where you're still Like, what?
Yeah, I guess.
Do you see what I'm getting at? I'm having a tough time articulating this. But who of value are you going to get at the trade deadline with that limited cap room without moving money out in the first place? Like, this is very short-sighted, but at a certain point, what's the difference between 1.8 million and 1 million when you're trying to get a top 6 difference?
Been there.
Yeah.
Story of my life.
All of us have.
Yeah,
when you're trying to get
true.
A difference maker. You're not just getting a stopgap on your fourth line.
Yeah, I guess it depends. I mean, there are deals to be made, whether it's, packaging Bacchus in that, or you're getting, and you're just, I think if they get to that point, they're unloading prospects for a big deal.
Yeah.
And having somebody take on.
Or high picks.
Right, yeah, and having someone take on money. So I guess that's a fair point. I don't know. I was looking at that the story The Athletic had about him, where there was, let's see, I have some of my notes here. An NHL source, a scout, and another NHL source. So just a smattering of quotes. I think the key players in LA value guys that play both ways. They also value a player that's scored enough that would help them win. He didn't do either. Says one source. An NHL scout said, this is to The Athletic, he wasn't able to defend responsibly, just not a good enough player anymore. It happens to everybody. And then an NHL source said he could be good somewhere else as maybe a power play specialist, but he'd have to accept his role. He still thinks he's an elite player. Yada, yada, yada. And he says he could be a power play specialist, basically. And I don't know if that's a real issue for the Bruins right now.
Yeah.
I mean, the second unit isn't great, but you just look at a lot. That doesn't sound very Bruins-esque, none of that, where I think they clearly, it'd just be a weird move for them to bring in somebody who just says, they're basically telling him, just go do your thing and don't worry about the rest. I think they kind of already have that in David Pastrnak, And at least with Pastrnak, you can hope on him developing his game. With Kovalchuk, you get what what you see is what you get. Yeah. Nothing's changing, and if that goes south, then you're kind of in a tough spot. I think that from inside the room, it wouldn't be an issue or anything like that.
No,
and I even think that the Kings said good things about him as a person, so I don't think that's a big deal either. It's just, I don't know. It's a weird player to bring in.
It is, and if the Bruins had any sort of stable option on the second or third line right wings, I'd probably say no go, it's not worth it. But the fact of the matter is they don't. And I personally would be fascinated to see them take a chance on Kovalchuk instead of Bacchus or Ritchie.
Right.
Like, you talk about guys that you know what you're getting. And if they're only going to play, if Bruce Cassidy's only going to play Bacchus and Brett Ritchie 9 minutes a night whenever they're in the lineup, why not use on a guy who has a very demonstrated history of a scoring prowess? And I know that Bacchus does too, and Brett Ritchie had his 16 goals, 3 years ago.
Yeah.
But if you're going to be taking risks on guys that you're probably going to give limited minutes to, why not? Mm-hmm. If he signs for the vet minimum too, which I don't think he'd get anything higher than that pretty much anywhere else.
Sure. I guess. I mean, I'm down just for the storyline. I think it's something to talk about. That's why I love the Yager deal a few years ago.
Yeah.
It's like, this is cool. It's like Jaromir Jagr's a Bruin. I don't think this one has the same allure, but it would at least
probably not
give us some talking points at least. So yeah, I could be talked into it. I think you've done a decent job of convincing me to the point where
probably the nicest thing you've ever said to me.
I do think you raised a good point about the what they're going to be able to do at the deadline anyway. So I don't know.
Keep it coming.
That kind of ruins our. That just ruins our year-long trade deadline talk. So
we'll find something to talk about. We'll create sham trades.
Definitely, I can't wait. Anything else you want to talk about?
No, let's get out of here.
Merry
Christmas.
What's your Bruins Christmas wish? What is your Christmas? If you're the Bruins, what do you want under the tree?
Is this like a trade thing?
I don't know. What do the Bruins need for Christmas? I've cornered
this take for so long. And you know what? You want to talk about deals they can do at the trade deadline that become increasingly more feasible by the day? Get Blake Coleman from the Devils.
Okay.
That's what the Bruins should be doing. I don't think the Devils are going to have a fire sale. There have been reports out there that they're not going to have a fire sale. But Blake Coleman would be a perfect fit on the Bruins for what they're looking for.
Okay. And I will say just any sort of offensive production out of Charlie McAvoy, who has one goal in the last 6 years.
Led the team in shots against the Kings.
Sure. Well, then fine. Then a little puck luck for Chuck.
Yeah, and just back to my Blake Coleman thing, because you can never have enough chatter about that on a Bruins podcast on December 19th. He's on he has a 1.8 million AAV, and he signed this year and next, so you can get him under the cap. Already this season, 9 goals, 7 assists for a crap-ass Devils team, 36 points last year. Plays on second or third lines. They've put him pretty much everywhere. So nice cost-controlled middle six guy. Left shot, so that would create a little bit of issues if you want to put him on the second line between him and DeBrusk.
Yeah.
But nevertheless, he is a better option than pretty much anyone else you have right now. So if I'm the Bruins, that's what I want for Christmas. It's Blake Coleman and Blake Coleman and the Spoked Bee.
Wow. Okay. Cool. Exciting.
Yeah, I can tell you're just
Very
entrenched in this.
That is
Blake
what you're
Coleman
looking
talk.
for, hoping under the tree. All right, yeah. Merry Christmas. We will be back. We will probably not reconvene for quite some time.
Yeah, 2 weeks from now,
Probably 2 weeks,
right?
yeah.
At least.
What would that be,
all
the
next
second?
week. Yeah.
After the New Year.
Yes. Yeah, something like that.
Alrighty. Well, it's been real.
It has.
See you next year.
Merry Christmas. Yeah, see
Merry
you next year.
All right. I'm Mike. That's Logan. We'll catch you again in 2020.